You are listening to Single Serves. My name is Arno Martire and I am your host. Single Serves is a podcast dealing with design, architecture, business, and city building in which I interview an expert on a specific subject matter. Together, we dive into that topic and challenge conventional thinking in a thought-provoking conversation. I sincerely hope that you will find these conversations as engaging as I did and learn a thing or two in the process. Don't forget to send us your comments, criticism, and praise. To do so, you can email us at hello@rvltr.studio or leave a comment online. You can also subscribe to the podcast on our website at rvltr.studio. James Melia is a British designer working in the fields of industrial design, branding, packaging, visualization, and UX and UI. A keen observer of human behaviors, he has been interested in unusual solutions to common problems for as long as he can remember. Since founding the studio Blond in 2015, he's worked with a variety of clients looking to disrupt their respective industries. Today, we're going to talk design with James, along with some of his work and outlook onto the future. So thank you very much, James, for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So can you tell us who you are and what you do in your own words in 3 sentences or less?
3 sentences or less, eh? Okay, challenge. We are a industrial design agency based in central London. We primarily focus on industrial design, or we do have offshoots of that, like visualization and UI and branding, which you've already mentioned. And fundamentally, as an agency, we focus on bringing a really deep-rooted narrative to the products that we produce and focus on a very high level of quality as well.
So when did you figure out that you wanted to become a designer?
Good question. I think I fell into it. I think I was kind of attracted to being a graphic designer, like at school, and not feeling anything more than just being relatively superficial and thinking it was quite a cool profession, and seeing that, wearing suits and, doing something that is maybe not conventional in this sort of academic sense. And then as I went through the school process, I started to realize I enjoyed making things and bringing 3D objects to life. Your DT lessons and things like that you have in the UK. I don't know what you call it in the US or in Canada. And then I went to university with the intention of being a BSc engineer, basically, so a product engineer, design with engineering focus. Did a foundation course in engineering, passed, surprisingly, maybe not so surprisingly, and then realized, though, at the end of that it wasn't really for me. It was too technically focused. As much as I really enjoyed the technical element, I'm much more driven and drawn to the creative side of industrial design. So it was a really lucky and fortunate path that led me to the creative industrial design profession.
So let's talk a bit about design in more general terms. We hear a lot about the idea of good design. And I personally have an opinion on what that would be. What is good design in your opinion?
Big question. A good design fundamentally has to consider sustainability. When we're talking about designing 3D products, which we do all the time, inevitably these things have a lifespan. So as an industrial designer, you have to consider sustainability in everything that you do. That's the first thing. Almost frustratingly, entering design awards recently, I've noticed that there's always a category for sustainable design, quote unquote. There shouldn't be a category. It shouldn't even be, a separate topic. It should just be embedded in every single one of the other categories. So that's the first thing. But to achieve that, maybe it's not always just about the materials you use. Sometimes it comes down to how you actually manage the aesthetics and ensuring there's no aesthetic obsolescence, that it's designed into something. So not following trends. And that's a big thing for Blond and my agency. We don't necessarily follow trends. Obviously we're aware of them. We don't, intentionally disregard them. We just are not drawn to them or follow them from a creative point of view. we design things and embed kind of an aesthetic and a narrative to our products that is really driven by the user's requirements, functionally, aesthetically, and from that you naturally get a product that has an inherent longevity to it because it's useful and aesthetically it's not going to go out of date. So for me, that's a good product. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of my favorite product brands is OXO. I'm sure you're familiar with them.
Yeah, they do good work.
And while their products are pretty cheap, both in terms of price and quality, meaning that some of them eventually end up breaking, but I find myself going back to it because they're so well designed from the perspective of like the user experience and how they fit in your hands because they're kitchen utensils, right? So I think a lot of the qualities you've described are in products like that. So when you start designing a product, like, you're given a brief, how do you go about making sure that all the things you've described are part of it? And what are some of the challenges you face when you're coming up with a new product for a client?
It's interesting to circle back to your first point that you mentioned OXO. So we work with one of their biggest competitors here in the UK. I think it's slightly larger, called Joseph. We designed a water bottle for them recently. Have I would say a very similar stance and benefits to their consumers. They're always looking for a USP that is actually beneficial. It's not just a gimmick. It really does solve a problem. And so working with them has been really enjoyable because they have a certain synergy, I think, in the way we approach work. But to answer your second question, it depends upon the client, depends upon the brief. Every brief is so different. Sometimes you can get a paragraph from a large corporation and 20 pages from one certain client. And the first thing you need to do is to sort of really define what the brief is and sort of collaborate on that. First of all, there's a lot of things. That's something that people don't necessarily talk about. They talk about doing the design work, but sometimes just collaborating on the brief to an extent is a really important step. Really understanding what the client wants, whether there's any way to make it better and to increase the business strategy or increase the way that we manage to benefit the user. From there, what we would do is look to conduct with everything we do, depending on budget, obviously, it scales up and down, but a holistic bit of product strategy and obviously research primarily before that. And that allows us to identify market opportunities from a commercial sense, but more importantly, functional requirements, and often functional requirements that the user wouldn't know they even had, that help us answer problems and create a really meaningful and useful product.
And so a big part of design, both industrial and I think in any other area of design, architecture, interior design, graphic, is really to take the brief, kind of study it, do your own research, so to speak, and see if you can come up with maybe a better brief or a better solution to the client's problem. So that's pretty well understood by designers. Do you ever walk away from a client because you don't understand the brief or the brief doesn't mesh with what your firm's about, or you always try to maybe show them a different way or a different path, or maybe an entirely different solution?
All of the above, actually, to an extent. I would never walk away from a brief to understand it. We always make sure that we understood, first of all, before walking away. But we regularly turn down work. Just yesterday, we turned down work for a vaping product. I don't know, for us as an agency, none of my staff and me would want to be involved in anything nicotine related. So that's the first thing. That's to gel with the studio and what everyone's happy working on. You've got to think about your staff as well as overheads and just your general morals. Obviously, it's been quite a fortunate position like we are to be able to turn down work like that, which is generally quite highly paid. We will turn down work after collaborating on a brief, if we think that it's not going to be successful or actually bring benefit or have a reason to exist. That's the big one. If it doesn't have a reason to exist, essentially it's purely commercial and just for financial sake. we've turned down a few projects eventually after sort of fleshing out the brief for the client, because it is clear that it will potentially be landfill waste in a year or so's time, and sold cheaply, and just to make money primarily, unless it has some kind of drive behind it to better human existence or make people's lives better or easier, then we wouldn't necessarily take it on.
Yeah, that makes sense. So can you speak a little bit to maybe your design heroes? Who are the people you respect, both in the industrial design world, maybe outside as well?
I've been asked this question before, and there's maybe a cliche answer, but I've always enjoyed Dieter Rams's work and still do. Particularly from an industrial design point of view, particularly after Jonathan Ive and the Apple team were heavily inspired by his work. He's been popularized and almost a household name, I guess, but he is still an influence to some extent. There are several studios that have been operating for 20 plus years that I respect, continual output of good quality work. And then outside the industrial design world, or maybe crossing between industrial design and architecture, I've always enjoyed the likes of Van Jacobsen and Bruno Munari, just from a design thinking point of view, and their ability to be able to create long-lasting objects, like really elegant analog objects, that will always be enjoyed for generations.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you say about long-lasting objects that don't become obsolete, and you've touched on that a couple of times throughout this conversation. It seems like that's a common thread across your work, but are there other kind of design principles or a kind of philosophy or common threads that you can talk about that are very important to you?
Could you provide an example potentially, and then I will?
Well, similar to what you just said about obsolescence, designing objects that people will enjoy for a long time and not just discard because 2 years from now it looks like it's out of date, right? Or it's been replaced by the latest gizmo. So maybe to reframe that question, like speak about if you have any kind of principles that you can lay out that you have written down, or your philosophy about design and kind of how you approach each project.
There's three main principles that make up what we call conscious design. These are, first of all, we would say that every product needs to be useful. So it should be have a purpose and a positive impact on the user's life. If it's not useful, what's the point of it existing? Mm-hmm. Second, needs to be deliberate. So no detail is superfluous. I think you can see that in our work. Everything's been stripped back. I quite often say to the designers when I have design reviews, why do we have these like three separate details in this one product? Can we split it across and make sure that there is a particular meaning for that detail existing? I think that bestows all of the work that we do with minimalism, which is not intentional from an aesthetic point of view, but actually from a design story and narrative point of view. And then thirdly, we like to think of it as aware. So it needs to fit within the world we inhabit, and not just designed for today, but designed to be passed down and enjoyed by future generations. So again, touching upon the point that the recurring theme of the podcast so far.
I'm personally fascinated with objects that are designed predominantly because of how they function. I'm thinking about, cameras or motorcycles or cars. There's room for a bit of design, but because they function a certain way, and there's, when you use a camera, the shutter is always more or less in the same place, and you hold it more or less the same way. There's some paradigms that you can't really change, or it might be too disruptive to the way people use the object to change. What's your thought on that? And can some of those principles be applied to maybe less functional objects that have a little bit more room for design itself? Because I'm always fascinated. Like, I'm a photographer, so cameras no matter what brand you use, it's always kind of the same way. And I understand why, but I'd love to hear your take on that.
And there's a couple of elements that I guess define that. One, what people are used to.
Mm-hmm.
What functionally just absolutely works. There's a thing in industrial design, people say no one's been able to successfully redesign the umbrella because it's so perfect and everyone's so used to it. There's an element of that, I guess, to those things. Also, maybe there's a kind of industry standard that people are worried about disrupting, maybe. Most of the controls and the cameras to the right. Is that correct? I mean, what percentage of the world are right-handed? There's still a fundamental sort of concern about taking, especially on some of the larger, more analog cameras, the more professional ones, are taking analog controls and making them digital. I think it's going to be quite a disruptive product to rethink something like that. That's been exactly the same for 100 years. So,
yeah. And there are a few examples. I mean, the iPhone is the obvious one where you took something that had a keyboard and a tiny screen, and then you turned the screen into the keyboard and then kind of completely changed the paradigms. But those are pretty rare, right, it seems. And once something start working, it's more of an evolution than because fundamentally, if you take a car, it's working the same way it has for 120 years. It's evolved, obviously. It's more elaborate and more complex, but the basic driving experience is basically the same. So that's always been fascinating to me. And I wonder if someone had to invent a car today with today's technology, if it would be completely different, or if you had a blank slate, which is not going to happen, obviously.
I wonder whether it's just the car, though. And if you had a blank slate on the way that the infrastructure worked, as in the roads and the light systems and the roundabouts, then I think it'd be a very different thing. But the fact is that even these brand new electric cars, you're seeing that, look very conceptual, but they're actually existing, which is exciting. You're still pinned in with the same restrictions, right? The Tesla's got a floating iPad essentially and nothing else, which is amazing, interesting from a design point of view. They're still constrained by exactly the same parameters in terms of safety and road infrastructure.
Yeah, because you have to contend with the same infrastructure. You have a very good point. So is there a project of yours in particular that you're the most proud of, or that kind of stands out?
There was one recently. It's actually the brand I've already mentioned in the podcast, Joseph. They're kind of similar to Oxo, you've also mentioned.
The water bottle?
Yeah, that one particularly. I mean, it's a very, very difficult space to innovate in if you're not just sticking technology in something. I mean, people have put, LEDs and UV cleaning elements in water bottles, which is arguably innovative and useful, but eventually will time out and break. I think we always try to find some analog solution to a problem we know that we find. But first of all, I think actually being able to identify a opportunity in a space that's been so heavily occupied was really successful. I was very happy with. We actually did a lot of observational research. You ask people about water bottle, people are not going to say, have deep thoughts about their water bottle to an extent. So we went out into the middle of London just before the pandemic and took a couple of days just observing people using water bottles. And what we found was people on their phone had the water bottle in their hand, newspaper, and they're kind of struggling with this cap they've taken off. And so we just found this opportunity to try to somehow make the cap less of a thing that could be lost or could, just be an extra thing you have to hold in your hand. So from that observational research, which I'm the largest advocate of, as opposed to interviewing one-on-one or even, on a bigger scale, we were able to create a method where the cap just slides over the neck of the bottle and then stays there once you drink. So also has the benefits in terms of hygiene and storage. So, if you take the cap off, slip it over the neck and store it inside the cupboard, you're not going to get the smell, when it's being container sealed. That I'm particularly proud of, and even more so proud of it that people don't recognize it. It goes slightly unnoticed, which from a commercial point of view is a bit frustrating. There needs some messaging to sort of show you that you can use this function. But if we manage to create such a great USP and it not be screaming at you, then that answers all of the Blond ethos, everything we've been trying to achieve. And even though it's just a simple water bottle, is probably the thing that I'm most proud of because of that.
That's interesting. So how do you go about doing those observational studies? Like, where do you go to observe people using drinking bottles? That's a very interesting question to me.
Yeah, it's a bit of spying, isn't it? And obviously you don't want to take too many pictures because it's not, it's a bit strange. But yeah, we went into London, the underground, the tube, particularly where it's hot, Central Line. And luckily it was summer. So we saw, people carrying water bottles constantly. Typical sort of tourist hotspots in London, like Trafalgar Square and the Tate Museum, and various other places in London. And I sat there and observed. Basically, took a couple of tube stops, sat on some benches, watched people going about their lunch break with their reusable or non-reusable water bottle, and just how they were carrying it, how they're using it, how they're drinking from it. Yeah.
So you basically get paid to people watch.
Basically, this is a great job. Hey,
that's amazing. So you've alluded to that in the talking about the bottle, like the use of technology and industrial design, and I think that's a great segue to talk about more how big tech, or how tech in general, is getting used in industrial design, and how do you see that looking in the future?
It's a difficult thing to respond to. I think there's some exciting opportunities from the industrial design process with technology and how you present your work to clients, augmented reality and VR. From a product point of view, there are some great opportunities for us to be able to, better the world we live in, especially with, for example, EVs and electric transportation and e-mobility in general.
What would be maybe a dream project? Maybe there's an assignment that you've thought about that you'd like to get, but you haven't gotten a chance to. What would that look like to you?
I'm a furniture designer by trade. So I actually have a degree in furniture design. And I think actually a dream project now would be some expanding our furniture portfolio. So a desk chair, something that really benefits the ergonomics of and benefits just the way that people sit and their posture and general ergonomics of working. That would be an absolutely lovely project. That would be a dream project. Also, because it's relatively large, when you run an agency, small projects, as much as they're really fun, it's nice to have a long, large project that, takes a while to develop and you can really get your teeth sunk into. And then my answer is always the same. I mean, I've been asked it one or two times. As an agency, I always ensure that we have a variety of work coming through the door. I mean, we design within the same month coat hangers and refrigerators and air conditioners and glass Tupperware. So the variety is really important, I think, just to ensure that everyone is on their toes and interested, and every day is different for them, and enjoy coming into work. And so the dream brief is one that's different to the previous brief, which is a slightly non-answer, I suppose, but it's true. So
it's a very designer answer.
Yeah.
One of the last questions I have for you, it's a bit on the lighter side. Like, where does the name Blond come from, and what does it mean to you?
On the lighter side, but it has a long answer. I had a podcast a couple of weeks ago, and apparently the person did lots of question asking for the audience beforehand to say, what are your questions for James? And it was the main asked question, apparently. I understand why. I was looking for names for a long time, and I had lots of workshopping sessions with my friends, and I was trying to create this name that had this meaning and the way that, we bring design details together, and there's some process we're looking to adopt as an agency. And the first name that I landed upon, I thought that's it, was a name called Cohesion, right? It was Cohesion. And I thought, we both thought, that's it. We found a name. The person I was working with at the time has actually recently come back to the business. And we went to bed and woke up, and we'd both forgotten what the name was. So it was quite evident that wasn't the name, because it wasn't memorable. So from there, I was on a quest to look for something memorable. And in doing so, I was thinking about lots of different band names or company names or anything that sticks out in my head. And there's two that always stuck out in my head, which were Acne, which is a clothing brand, and Red Hot Chili Peppers, not a band I like, but I remember their name for some reason. I'll think about them. And after, I was trying to analyze.
Do you know what the Red Hot Chili Peppers' first name was?
No, go on.
So if I remember correctly, because it's a bit long and complicated, it's the Miraculously Majestic Masters of Mayhem.
I did know that. I was a big fan of their first couple of albums, particularly Californication. So I had heard that, I think. Yeah. Interesting. It's much better, Red Hot Chili Peppers, must admit. More memorable.
Yeah. It's probably a bit too punk, maybe for what they're doing now.
Yeah, maybe. And so basically, I was analysing those, and I thought they were really interesting case studies, because you don't think about the actual chili pepper when you think about Red Hot Chili Peppers. You think about the band, and and likewise with Acne, you don't think about spots. Again, I'm not still haven't looked at that. Probably should, but I think it's a French band. I think it means something else in French, maybe. But anyway, you think about the really beautiful bits of clothing they make, particularly if you know the brand. And therefore, I was looking for a name that stuck out in people's minds and they remembered. Equally, it needed to have some kind of meaning. I came up with the name of Blond, basically based upon the colour of wood, so it being relatively unobtrusive, not shouting, some kind of longevity to it aesthetically, as you've noticed, that's a running theme. And then also the added fact that it has this connotation of hair colour, which does make people smile and almost, laugh basically at you. Because of that, it doesn't get forgotten. I always give this example of when I was completely validated. I went into the room with LG UK one day. It was like really early days, my first time in the company. And one of the design directors said, as soon as you walked through the door, I think it was even before a hello, I expected you to be wearing blonde wigs. And he was taking the piss completely. Fine though, justified. But at that moment, as much as he was taking the mick, I knew that we'd, found a name that people would remember and ask about, as part of the joy of it.
Do you go to meetings wearing blonde wigs?
No,
because that would be a great icebreaker if you were like what is it called, a bob cut, or this kind of like really straight chin length hair with bangs. That would be hilarious.
Yeah, you call it bangs, don't you? Yeah. That would be funny. No, I don't know. And then the reasons are slightly less interesting.
And it's funny how a good name keeps on giving you new meanings over time, right? Yeah, that's how you know whether you've picked a good name or not, if you keep coming up with new meanings for it. One of the last questions I have, to get back to a slightly more serious topic, what are some of the lessons you've learned from being a successful industrial designer that you think could apply to architecture and interior design?
The running of a business, probably. I think that that crosses everything from all aspects of creativity and beyond. And starting a company, some of the lessons I learned early on maybe could transfer across. Obviously, looking to start an architecture business, maybe. I started it with no clients and their portfolio, and I took a £15,000 loan to basically fund 6 months plus of mortgage repayments and hope that I'd get some work. And my advice to people would be to take more if you're going to take a loan, because that was naive and that was far too little.
Yeah.
But to go for it, and that's the way to do it, is to add that pressure. Obviously there was a big risk there, but I had to make it work. There was and I always had this sort of relatively scared of public speaking. Even doing this kind of thing, I'd be quite nervous. I mean, throughout my whole life, and then during those first 6 months when I had the ticking pressure of the financial side of things, as much as I probably lost a bit of hair in the process, all those barriers that are once a worry gone. Suddenly I'll stop being nervous, talk to people, trying to get work, doing these kinds of things. So some of the biggest learnings I've had is just to, if you want to do it, you want to create your own business, just do it, take the risk, but maybe give yourself a little bit more of a buffer than probably 6 months worth of overheads.
And so how long was it until you got your first job?
Well, we were really lucky. I think we got one within the first... Well, it had a very small one right at the beginning within the first couple of days, but then I think the big one came within 3 or 4 weeks.
That's pretty fast.
I had been building a website, and I'd incorporated the company a year before when I was working full time, and every single weekend I've been building a portfolio, albeit conceptual. So it wasn't starting completely from scratch. I had something to hit the floor running with. Yeah.
Gotcha. That's all for the questions I had today.
Well, thank you very much for having me on, and thank you very much, everybody, for listening.
Hey, Arno here. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and that you'll come back for more. Please share with your friends and colleagues, and remember to subscribe on our website at rvltr.studio. Until next time, ciao.